Hello, everybody. Hope everybody had a good week last week. I think it was a good idea to not do a lecture so you guys could really engage, and it looks like you did on there. Um, this week, we're going to be going into corrective actions a little bit more in depth, and then we'll start pivoting over to tools shortly. Um, so just to kind of recap some stuff. So the presentations are all great. I got some questions about like what was required, etc. I think you all did a really good job of capturing the information in a brief and concise way that was direct. And it was also really interesting to see how you all kind of identified the various causal factors, your root causes, and especially your critiques. That's one of the best things about doing this, right? Is we never do anything perfectly, so we can learn a lot by looking at what others do and what they could have done better in that instance. It's not about judgment necessarily. It's just about what we're going to take away from that. So I think that went really, really well. And yeah, I'll just run through quickly any of the comments just to see. So on Elise's presentation, yeah, the comment, Jamie, that would be hard. We have a Korean colleague who I would have probably tapped for help, but that is odd that there wouldn't have been one, especially where it crashed on US soil too. That's another odd thing. So, and yeah, Todd, I think as we'll see in the Boeing presentation, maybe the tests weren't all that great, which is kind of a problem there. Exxon Valdez, I'm glad you guys, I think it was good that we had two people pick the Exxon Valdez because it is such a important accident. I mean, it spawned an act of Congress. We usually see some kind of actions after the fact, but very rarely do we see an entirely new law come into existence. So that's important to think about. Elise, yeah, you would think we know that now, right? That you probably shouldn't do that. I would wonder if there was any Titanic syndrome with like the shipbuilders or the engineers involved of, that it couldn't sink or couldn't, the hull couldn't be pierced or anything like that. And yeah, yeah, you're right. Not having the proper equipment to respond to spills is a huge issue. And it is one of those things of right. We covered this before in some of the design stuff. You need to design for error. You need to design for failure. It's just a recognition of reality. And so I think that's been an important change to some of those. 737 Max. Yeah, how much did it cost Boeing? I bet you there are articles out there that talk about that because their stock price dove for a while. Then they had to ground the entire fleet of 737s, even the ones that they could deem safe or whatever. Let's say they decided to train and document things, that's still, they were still grounded until the FAA said that you were good to go. Yeah, and I again, that's the real question, right? Nobody will ever say it, but somewhere in a boardroom or in a conference room at Boeing, somebody has made a graph of the cost of this fallout from the accidents and everything else versus the cost of not rushing it to market. That's a conversation that's been had. Yeah, and Todd highlighting, yep. And it's not the interesting thing is that has become very commonplace. Since the kind of the late 80s. I mean, we don't lay all the blame at Reagan's feet, but I think that whole movement of the mid to late 80s, an anti-government backlash type thing, has led to a lot of funding issues for some of these agencies that are tasked with protecting the public. We don't often think about how expensive it is to protect the public. I mean, I know I have 3 kids, and protecting them from doing dumb things is very expensive. I couldn't imagine having 350 million dumb kids. So, but this is common. I mean, the FAA still, I think, is underfunded for what its mission should be. The NRC is, the FDA is, especially for like food safety. That's been a big focus over the last like 5-10 years. The IRS has said that they can't audit rich people anymore because they don't have enough people. So we're definitely seeing that trend, which begs that question of, okay, if we're not going to do it right, should we do it at all, or should we just fund it more? How's that going? But it is a huge problem. You cannot expect the fox to watch the hens, right? Todd, yeah, I really enjoyed your critique of the root cause. So failure of industry management. If I saw that in the report, I'm thinking somebody's covering a butt. That is what's going on there. Remember, we talked about how human error can't be your root cause, or if you identify it as such, that you didn't go deep enough. Failure of industry management. Okay, and we'll learn this today. What is your corrective action for that? How do you fix that? I mean, so which is kind of by default makes it not a root cause, right? So that's definitely a huge concern. Yeah, so the scale of it, right? So this is what's interesting is you look at, and again, this is just the cost of an accident, right? So we think of money, millions of dollars were lost in seafood alone. I would imagine we could upgrade that to billions easily. It's nearly impossible to calculate the damage to environmental factors, ecosystems, food chains of animals, different things there. How many species maybe went extinct. Then we look at not just the cost to people who, fishermen who couldn't fish anymore and lost their livelihood, but then what about the cost after that? What's the real human cost, of shunting these families into a poverty or a hastily agreed upon settlement? It's a different thing, right? And so that's what's important to always consider too, is to make sure you're not losing sight of the people in all of it, right? Yeah, and people that were fired is an odd one, right? So, and usually not many. That's usually always the way it was. I mean, I remember when this happened, and there was, I remember BP was out talking all the time, constantly, which is like, okay, but what are you gonna do? You created the situations for this. So, and it also begs the question, right? Does firing these people change anything? Does it serve as a deterrent or whatever? Does it modify the culture at all? We see this just very current events with John Gruden, the coach of the Raiders, getting fired for emails he sent, a decade ago. Does that actually change anything in terms of the culture of the NFL? No, probably not. But, that's really what we want to think about when we're thinking about preventing these in the future. And then we have our Exxon Valdez part 2. And yeah, the recommendations were interesting. And I agree with Todd's question here. Like, the NTSB can make recommendations all at once, right? It doesn't have an enforcement arm aside from fining companies. And I don't know if you've all noticed this, but the fines that these companies or agencies seem willing to levy on these companies is like nickels to them. So, that's one of those questions, right? Is, were they adopted? Did you see the industry respond? So that's one unique thing where I work in nuclear. The Fukushima accident led not just regulators, it led the actual industry to respond in a way that is a little bit more holistic and was pretty effective to the flexible operation standards that came out. So that's kind of an interesting delineation there. And yeah, I like that you guys are identifying corrective action things. We'll get into this today. And then maybe you might, after this lecture, you might want to comment on this with kind of what we learned today, how that affects these topics. But I like that we're all identifying that. Yeah, just culture style assessment is one that you both caught, that a few you caught that they weren't in the assessments. That is one of those things that I hope becomes more common, right? Because as we discussed, a just culture seems to be almost critical to ensuring that you have a very safety conscious organization and one that prioritizes it. Yeah, Elise here is telling the pilots that there is a stall imminent and the stall protection feature has been turned off. It is crazy to me how little what we would call in human factors like current state recognition things are put into software systems. So the ability to quickly and simply be able to see the current state of the system you're using, what's on, what's off, what's working, what's not. And that is a huge problem that is, it's not in many systems, but something like that would help a lot. I'm glad everybody liked the human error sections. Human error is one of my favorite things. Yeah, so we created a new agency. One of the questions, right, like with the FAA stuff, is this agency funded well enough to accomplish its mission, right? Otherwise, is it just an office with some people who are buried in paperwork, right? Yeah, the well control rule was pretty effective, it seems like. And yeah, no just culture, right? And then you explain the culture of kind of oil production. That's especially true. And then keep in mind, we're in the United States. What about the culture of safety across the world with oil production, right? So that's definitely one of those things. And the risk perception. So the biggest reason I wanted you all to talk about risk perception is because as humans, we are really, really bad at risk perception. So I wanted you to highlight the areas that we messed up in a lot of those. So either way, I think it was good. I think you guys did a great job. So pivoting to the next batch. So you all picked a second event to look at. So, start to pivot to that by next week. Do an initial post, kind of similar to what you did when you picked these initial events. What happened, give us the details. You can just use, if you want, the same format, bullet by bullet, whatever, of your initial posts, or if you want to adjust it, take a different tack on this, that's fine. As I said before, if you cannot find stuff related to your event, some of you have picked some really interesting, but also somewhat recent events that there might not be as much in terms of official, formal governmental stuff. So if you need something like that and you can't find it, let me know. And yeah, we'll be good. So going into corrective actions. And this will be good because you all had to kind of report on this with your event. So I'm going to be interested to see your takeaway of, okay, now that you know what a corrective action should be, go back to those and were they right? So a corrective action is an action if actions which, if taken, would either remove the root cause and therefore make the event impossible, or would work to mitigate the event causal factors or impacts. Some other terms you might see here are immediate actions or interim actions. Obviously, corrective actions. Long-term corrective actions is another one. They're just basic corrective actions is usually considered relatively short term, within 6 months, 8 months usually. And then, yeah, take a look at these with your events. Let's try to separate out all of the events we picked are pretty big, so there may be all three of these, but what immediate actions were taken. The 737 MAX, they grounded all the planes. That's a pretty drastic immediate action, but it was one that they felt they needed to do. If I remember correct, that happened fairly quickly. And then what are some of the long-term corrective actions and those kind of aspects. Then the corrective action effectiveness. So this is kind of a simpler charting style to kind of determine where corrective actions land in terms of being effective. So, a couple of you identified in your events that there were design issues, which, yes, if you design something well and you design away or design out as many of the hazards as you can, it makes those hazards impossible. So it is generally considered to be the most effective. And then we kind of go down to, personnel, procedures, different things like that. Or the least effective is just identifying the risk and acknowledging it. That's not actually going to help you in terms of an organizational choice. And just it's listed on there, but just so you know, training is usually considered less effective because it just doesn't seem to have the staying power, and it's still relying on human actions. So here's some other examples of where we get from low effectiveness up to high. So self-check, supervision, peer check, firewatch, caution tags, these things are relatively low effectiveness. Why? Because people happen. Confined space posting or emergency operating procedures. We're getting into the middle realm. Safety glasses and hard hats, obviously noting as long as you're wearing them. Anti-contamination clothing, all these we're getting closer. Then we get into alarms, interlocks, engineered safeguards, or reactor vessel shield wall as an example. That's a design choice to prevent some hazard. So effective corrective action plans. This is the CAP. So you'll hear sometimes CAP. That's a common acronym. So in order to have an effective corrective action plan, you have to have a clear linkage between the cause and the corrective action. They work, back and forth. Every cause has a corrective action. Every corrective action has a cause. You need to be aware and watch for unintended consequences. This is why it's important to take your time and be thoughtful in developing your corrective actions. Include the intent or the desired outcome of the action within the action's text or instructions. Document the completed corrective actions. Develop any interim or intermediate corrective actions. And then consider the risk to repeat recurrence during the completion of the overall action plan. So is it likely that you're going to have another event while you're trying to fix the problems that caused the first one? That's where your interim and immediate corrective actions live. In some events, you'll see that interim or immediate corrective actions are somewhat dramatic because, again, if the risk of an event occurring is significant, then even having a small risk is not worth it to most stakeholders. So that's a concern. Okay. So SMARTS, this is another acronym you'll hear about. It's definitely prevalent in nuclear circles. I'm not totally sure if it lives outside of that realm, but the concepts are still valid. So a SMARTS corrective action or corrective actions that are SMART are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely, and sustainable. So what does that mean in terms of this? So your corrective action should, the level of detail should be such that the individual who is assigned to carry out the action can understand both the reasons for the action and each step, task, action, or behavior required to effectively implement the action or expectation. This is partially why we put the reasoning for the corrective action and the intended goal in the text so that happens. That can also begin a conversation if somebody is working on that corrective action and they see what your intended goal is, but what your corrective action isn't going to work, then they can reach out and a conversation can be had there. Keep in mind your level of detail based on knowledge level of the target audience. In general, you do not want a bunch of technical jargon or assume knowledge in your corrective actions. They need to be short, concise, self-explanatory, and free of words and phrases that could imply a double meaning. Measurable. So the desired outcome of your corrective action should be clearly described such that it can be seen physically during an observation, or the physical outcome is obvious. This is the situation of, oh, there's a tripping hazard, this sidewalk is shifted, and then somebody comes out and rips out that piece and puts in a new piece, and okay, now we can physically see that it is different. Achievable, so within the organization's responsibility, resources, and they are qualified to perform. So, you want to make sure you assign, when you're assigning a corrective action, you're assigning it to the right place, and that the organization has that authority and power to do that. Resource concerns live here too. This is why a lot of organizations will have evangelists or like people in the management chain that are pushing corrective actions and enabling them. Needs to be realistic. So compatible with the organization's goals, values, and strategy. This is an interesting one with commercial accidents, right? Because a commercial operation, it's probably not realistic to assume that increased regulation is compatible with their goals, values, and strategy. Sometimes, but that is something to look at. Timely. So actions need to have a specific time for completion that is realistic for the task and commensurate with the significance of the problem. So you need to, that's where sometimes as you're writing corrective actions, you may work with the people who will be implementing them, and they can explain to you kind of, okay, that job's going to take X amount of weeks or months or whatnot, and you can ensure that the corrective action is written appropriately. And it is sustainable. So an action is captured programmatically, has reminders if human performance is related, and it has controls so that it can't be unintentionally removed. Some of these will be like software features too, or you'll have checks, manager checks or approvals if you're going to close a corrective action ahead of time or whatnot. And when they say an action is captured programmatically, that is so that ownership of the corrective action is higher than just the individual contributor or IC level, so that management can ensure that the culture captures that corrective action as well. So if some corrective actions can be smart, some can be stupid. So I'm not going to define all these, but these are ones that as I was looking over the presentations, you all have captured some or highlighted some corrective actions that are stupid. They're superficial. So this is the failure of industry management. What does that even mean? That is a superficial, or that was a root cause. So the root cause is problematic anyway. But what would in the world is your corrective action going to be for that? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Or some of the aircraft issues, with increased training, or we're going to tell the pilots that something is there. Okay, that's a corrective action, but is it as strong or as smart as it could have been? Unclear there. So you really just want to look through these. So superficial, theoretical, unachievable, perpetual, irrational, or difficult. So unachievable, perpetual, and difficult are ones that you will you might see a lot. I know when I've done corrective actions, maintenance organizations usually have some questions along those lines. And I've totally had to go back in and adjust a corrective action because what I had originally identified just wasn't doable or didn't make sense for that particular circumstance or context. So that's not uncommon, but I would imagine, there may be some in here, of your corrective actions that you see that fit into this. And sustainable corrective actions, they merit a little bit more discussion. So some examples of sustainable actions. Remember, these are sustainable in the sense of whatever the action was supposed to bring about, whatever that change is going to be, that change will persist. It's not going to just Oh yeah, we totally are doing that for a couple weeks, and then it just people forget and move on. So design changes that eliminate the failure mechanism, changes to programs and processes, written performance expectations in a document, guideline, or policy, something obviously with accountability attached to it. New or increased frequency preventative maintenance is a big one, especially in heavy equipment or high levels of equipment industries. Some of the aircraft issues, right? Preventative maintenance might have helped some of those. And recurring training and qualification. The key difference with like the next couple bullets down, right? Actions that don't have long-term sustainability, single shot training. A one-off training that isn't sustainable kind of by definition because it's one-off, but recurring qualification and recertifying, those kind of things are a little bit more sustainable. One-time communications or reinforcement of expectations. That's not okay. Like that's the memo from the C-suite that says, why, yes, we totally believe and support this and it's part of our values and blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't actually do anything. Counseling, this is specifically not mental health counseling. This is specifically counseling of actions. Talking through somebody what happened and oh, that's no good. That's not going to help because it's not going to actually change the context of their behavior and how they're going to perform in the future. And repair or do a like for like replacement of a failed component. That's also one that, asking why it failed. This corrective action would just be, well, it did, so we're going to replace it. No, you need to know why, because obviously whatever one you had was a problem. And your corrective action effect. So remember, and we talked about this earlier, but just to bring it back around, a corrective action should eliminate the cause or causes of the significant event so that the same or similar events are not repeated, and more importantly, cannot be repeated, or they mitigate the consequences of a repeat events, or they significantly reduce the probability of occurrence of similar events of lower significance. So most events will have all of these. You'll have corrective actions that at least their intent is to do all of these things. And that's the way it should be, right? We don't want to become so arrogant that we think, yes, we always identify the root cause appropriately, and now this will never happen again. We can take that stance, but then we also need to build in some other things of if we're wrong. Laws are a great example of corrective actions. This helped me when I was learning this, kind of trying to find a metaphor for it. So laws are corrective actions, as are warning labels, regulations, most signs. And remember, we're trying to control and guide behavior. You always see those. I just saw this on Twitter. There was a door to, it looked like maybe a restaurant or something, where it was, your standard no shoot, no shoes, no shirt, no service thing. But then it said no penguins, which was just an odd thing. And it makes you wonder, why is that there? It's there because it's a corrective action. They are trying to stop people from doing something. And now that is one of their corrective actions, is tell them about that. So like this image on the bottom left here, I would imagine a lot of trucks hit that bridge, and it was significantly cheaper to lose a couple of these cross beams a year versus one incident on the bridge. So you'll see these signs sometimes that are supposed to reinforce that this is a problem and this is our corrective action, because realistically, what would be the smartest corrective action? Raise up the bridge. But that is a very significant action. There might be resource constraints or something. So that's another thing to recognize, is sometimes we can't do the right corrective action at the time. So we try to get the next best thing. So that's kind of it for this week. But mainly I wanted to keep this one kind of brief. So because corrective actions can be kind of weird. We might revisit them a little bit next week too. But I want you all to kind of keep commenting on posts, especially on the corrective action things. You've all read through each other's presentations now. So dig into those and the comments that everybody's made and see what you think. But we will start going into the tools, the actual way that we do accident investigation and cause analysis and etc. soon. We'll probably spend a week on each one of these is my best guess. Change analysis and why trees might end up being one, but the rest of them, they're pretty in-depth and involved tools. So one of the key things that'll be different for your second event presentation is I'm going to want you to highlight or identify the tools that were done. If it says, if not, you can kind of take your best guess based off of corrective actions or other various info. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Just like to give you a heads up of the process of it, of the class and where we're going. And we will probably, so the process that we went through in terms of the accidents themselves and the events and discussing them, we're probably just going to mimic what we did the first round for the second round. I'll keep putting up the specific questions in the Slack so you know kind of what to answer. But I would say the next week, just try to dig into what the next one was. There's, I think actually this next batch will be more interesting than the first. Not like the first ones weren't, but the next batch, you guys all picked some really interesting ones. So, and as always, let me know if you have any questions or anything. I will try to get you a formal grade on the presentation. So I'll try to do that over the next week. And yeah, I think that'll be it. But yeah, good effort and good presentations all around. I think you all did a really good job on that. So, all right, thanks.